Hey there, welcome back to our third video. In the previous video we looked at sending information from Rhino and receiving that in ETABS. We had some difficulty or limitations with regards to the properties that we could assign to our 3D objects. We had no choice in the type of cross-section or the material, and we look to alleviate those issues now by introducing Grasshopper. So we're going to start off by looking at our Speckle Schema Objects in Grasshopper, lacing those together to give us an idea of what user attributes we can define in Rhino in order to read in our information from Rhino into Grasshopper and not just have geometry. So we'll have meaningful geometry, meaning we have geometry with some properties assigned to it. So let's get into it. Here we have our Rhino analytical model. Because in the first video we have defined or we have downloaded our Grasshopper and Rhino connectors, if I open up my Grasshopper canvas now, we automatically see two things. We have Speckle 2 in this top ribbon and in the second ribbon. In the objects and management, I'm going to hide my face. In the objects and management, we have a Speckle Schema object. If we then drop that on the canvas, we see that we have 197 different objects to choose from. We're going to look at creating a structural beam or column, so a 1D element. So under structural CSI geometry, we have a element 1D from local axis. So if I click on create, it's going to drop that on the canvas immediately. And we see the properties, all the inputs that we need in order to define a valid element 1D. For the baseline, we can grab those from Rhino. We already have all the lines modeled, and we can then also look at defining a property. For the type, we already have default values of bar, but we can look at assigning either a beam or column depending on what you want to assign. For the additional properties, these are all marked with a question mark, which means these are optional characters. If we don't provide anything, it's just going to default to whatever is usually defined in ETABS. For end releases, for example, that would just be frame elements without any hinges at the ends, or for stiffness modifications, those will all be set to 1. So let's focus on the non-optional characters. So for baseline, we're just going to be receiving that from Rhino. For property, we'll need to define something again from our Speckle schema. So if I define that, we want under structural, we have properties, and we're looking for property 1D. And we're going to be grabbing this one where we can access a name, a material, and a profile. So if I click on create, that will be feeding then into that input. And we can look at what this additionally needs. This needs a name. We can provide that in Grasshopper, a material, and a profile. So the same thing here. I'll just look at what we have available in the Speckle schema. So under materials, we can have a very generic structural material where we just give it a design code, a grade, and a type. And we can assign that there. The final thing that we'll need is our profile. So if we go back to the Speckle Schema object, this is a bit tedious, but it'll be good to set it up in this way. Under properties, we have many different profiles. As I mentioned, we're looking at defining a reinforced concrete structure. So I'm going to be defining some rectangular sections as well as some circular sections. We can look at what a rectangular looks like. If we see here, it's also asking for inputs of web thickness and flange thickness. This doesn't necessarily mean that it is a steel section. We'll look at in the next video looking how to define this in the context of concrete cross sections, but I'm just going to create this for now. It'll look something like that, where we have a profile going into our property 1D, and those are all the parameters we need to define a column or a beam. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at using the user attributes in Rhino. So if I look in the top right here, and if I click on a column, if I look at the top right here and under attribute user text, you can see I've already defined 3 different key value pairs. For the structural material type, I have a value of 0. And what that means, if we go back into Grasshopper, for this structural material type, we see that it's inheriting a value of 3 because it's currently set to aluminium. If I flick that onto concrete, we see that the type has changed to 0. And how we know what that is defining, if we open up the value list constant, we see what integer is assigned to which material. So that's that. If I close it again and look, we have structural material grade as well as property 1D profile. And we've written this in such a way that I can later in Grasshopper split that by a certain character and then filter information respectively. In the same breath, we have for our surfaces, we have again structural type 0, so concrete, and we have our structural material grade, and we have the thickness. So we have all of our user attributes set up. In the next video, we're going to look at bringing that information in from Rhino, receiving it into Grasshopper, and creating all of our native elements, which we can then send to ETABS. I'll see you there.